Okay, welcome back. Welcome back, everybody. This is our start of part 4 of our discussion of from the High Baroque to the Age of Enlightenment. And I want to go back just for a little bit because um, we were talking about the Rococo and how it started in France as a movement and what French Rococo in 1718, 1750s looked like. But I also wanted to remind you that at the same time, what we were seeing in the rest of Europe in the Baroque was not quite as dramatically Rococo, but what we saw probably would be well um, embodied by Tiepolo. That Tiepolo is this kind of the international style version of the Rococo, and in a way also a compromise with of the Rococo with the High Baroque. Um, and so that's going on in a large part of Europe, and I wish we had time just to talk about Tiepolo on his own and Tiepolo in terms of in relation to architectural projects, because he was an amazing painter and fun to talk about. But right now, also just want to go a little further about this kind of like developing international style, which at first, like I said, was kind of a compromise between the Rococo and the High Baroque, but then also becomes kind of a compromise between those things and neoclassicism. And we see that uh, that kind of balance in someone like Lebrun's career, where oh, where in this work right here, we can see we can see a lot of influence from the Rococo in the palette and in the color, the translucency, transparency, um, and somewhat in the paint handling. But there is also kind of a precision to it that's like the more like the uh, neoclassical painters. But then in these later works, she definitely shows more of an influence of neoclassical thinking. And put it over there. I also just want to have a hard time kind of fitting exactly where Chardin should fit in, and perhaps I should have skipped him, since I did also skip some of the Dutch still life painters and people like Frans Hals. Um, but one of the things that I think is interesting is to remember that there's, when we're talking about all these big ideas, that there's always kind of outliers or artists who are doing other things. And Chardin, although maybe influenced by some of the ideas of Rococo and some of the ideas of neoclassicism, he was doing his own thing, um, and in some ways continuing a tradition that we saw in Dutch painting of much more an emphasis on genre painting. The Dutch also did a lot of still life painting and much more of an interest in painting kind of representing um, other classes than just the elites. And so in some ways he's also a precursor of what we will see in the Romantic era with the realists, people like Courbet. Um, and I also want to show that there are other kind of influences or spreading of style going on. And someone like Leotard, we looked at him earlier in the semester because of this gorgeous drawing, because we were talking about pastel drawings, and it is a fantastic pastel drawing. Um, and but also, he was a French-Swiss painter and draftsman, and also kind of showing some of an attempt at compromise um, in in these various styles, but also kind of more of an emphasis on genre. And that leads us to talking about England, and this is pretty much the end of our lecture. And I just want to say, about England, that for a long time England was kind of outside these movements, or only affected by it by the fact that it imported painters, people like Anthony van Dyck, um, to work in England. But starting at at around the mid 1700s, England started to much more have its own, school of painting, and it was dominated by these two artists, Gainsborough and Reynolds. And Gainsborough, although he was the younger, he was much more um, the champion of kind of the French style of the Rococo and of a very kind of a loose paint handling, um, whereas Reynolds was more more conservative. He was not a neoclassicist by any means, um, but he was um, much more interested in a more conservative style, and more of a compromise style. And I think in some ways Reynolds was the superior painter. You see lots of Sir Joshua Reynolds around at almost every museum you go to, and I am almost always impressed. And then that leaves us with one more artist I want to talk about, who is not nearly as big a name as the last two that we talked about, and not nearly as significant or important in art history as almost any of the people that we've talked about in these lectures. But I'd like to end here because one of the things that's going on at the same time as all of this stuff is, we are entering the age of enlightenment. And in France, you see that in literature, but you don't, and in some ways, neoclassicism is a reflection of the age of enlightenment, but we don't really have an artwork that is for the age of enlightenment. But what Joseph Wright Derby was doing here, although maybe it's pronounced Darby, um, what he was doing here was definitely, or could have been seen as an art for the age of enlightenment. And and the small group of friends that he collaborated with, who were scientists and writers and some other artists, who would do public demonstrations of scientific principles, and that Joseph Wright would do paintings like this one right here, kind of demonstrating those ideas. This was this had the potential of being the art of maybe of a new direction. But for various reasons, it did not turn out to be. It was maybe a dead end culturally. I think maybe part of the reason was because if you look at the date, 1768, very shortly, Europe enters not, a further age of enlightenment, but enters an age of revolution. And I think in some ways the idealism and optimism of these paintings becomes quickly old fashioned. Um, but nonetheless, I think now looking back, his kind of, synthesis style, um, thinking about people going back to Caravaggio, but also a kind of a neoclassicist sort of um, seriousness, but for the purpose of demonstrating things like, scientific experiments and everyday modern life. That could have been a more influential uh, part of culture, but for whatever reason, for various reasons, it wasn't. Anyway, so this is where we end, and next we will talk about the Age of Revolutions and the Romantic era. All right, thanks.